I'm John Hinkle, Senior Pastor of First Presbyterian Church. This is your Saturday morning preview of Sunday morning sermon. First Presbyterian Church, of course, is on the corner of College and Spring in downtown Murfreesboro. First of all, shout out to Bill Richmond. Bill called a mistake I made. I think I referred to MTSU as the Blue Hose. Of course, Presbyterian College is the Blue Hose. MTSU is Big Blue. I guess but they're home of the Raiders. So at least I know Bill's watching. So we are continuing our series of sermons on the understanding of grace. I love kind of where we've been so far. It actually started with that last sermon, looking at Amazing Grace being the most impactful hymn in the American church culture. And then we kind of moved forward and we talked about in that first sermon, just exactly what is grace? What is grace? It's God's unmerited favor, meaning God, there's nothing we can do to earn, steal, or buy God's grace. And grace is favor, meaning God chose us. And Bobby, in Time with the Young Church, used the definition that God's got us. And I like that. There's nothing we can do to get God to get us. And Philip Yancey said it in his book, What's So Amazing About Grace? Grace reminds us that there's nothing we can do to get God to love us more, and there's nothing we can do to get God to love us less. And the other thing we talked about last Sunday was that God's grace never runs dry. God's grace, it may feel like we are far from God's grace, but in reality, God's grace is always right in front of us. And the way we get God's grace, receive God's grace, is to lean into our faith. Trust that God's grace is there. Trust that God's grace is sufficient for our lives. And then the other notion, and it was kind of a throwaway line, but when we receive God's grace, we don't need more of God's grace. God's grace is enough. So, that's kind of where we are. And now we're moving forward to this notion of what happens when we have God's grace. What are we supposed to do with God's grace? Our text comes from Peter. I've got it right here. But he says, I'm trying to find it. Let me see. This is always embarrassing. Hold on. Let's see. This is why you watch Saturday morning previews, Sunday morning sermon, so you see me struggling and find out where we are. Golly, I cannot believe I can't find this. Anyway, basically what 1 Peter says is that we're supposed to grow in God's grace. When we have grace, we're supposed to grow in God's grace. But see, these are my pickleball glasses. They're not my reading glasses, so I'm almost blind when it comes to reading. Anyway, so when we have God's grace, we're supposed to then grow in God's grace. And so in our sermon, that's kind of what we're talking about. What does that mean to grow in God's grace? What does that look like? What are we supposed to do with it? Now, part of God's grace is to help us. It's to help us, take another step forward, help us get through this day and get ready for the next day. It's to help us overcome whatever obstacles we are facing. But it's not just to help us. God's grace is meant to empower us to show grace to others. Let me say that again. As we have received grace, so we're called to give grace to others, which is a really hard thing to do when you think about it. When you're struggling with whatever's going on in your life, you're grateful for the grace that you receive. But let's be honest, we're just trying to survive. And thinking about others and others' needs is really maybe the kind of the last thing we're thinking about. And one of the things that I was thinking about this morning, and I may add it to my sermon, is that one of the ways I think, therefore, to really make God's grace real. Like I think we're aware when grace has been given to us by God, but to truly be aware of what that means is when we in return give God's grace to others. In fact, the more we give grace, the more God's grace will be abundantly clear. That's not a quid pro quo, like, God gives us grace, so we give others grace, so that God will give us grace, so that we will give others grace. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying that God gives us grace. It's there. It is in front of us. But if you really want to make God's grace real, then you take that grace that's been given you and give it to others. So that's it. That's the Saturday morning preview of Sunday morning sermon. I'm sorry I, couldn't find that anywhere I couldn't find it in Peter's text. I think it's the right text. Let's see. Y'all just stick with me. Savannah, just stick with me. Glenn, stick with me. Hold on, let me see. What's the date? Yeah, that was the text. I can't find it for some reason. All right, that's it. Saturday morning preview, Sunday morning sermon. Y'all be good.